Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of the Junkyard Dawgcast, a instant reaction episode. I'm your host, Jordan Hill. With me, as always, is Ben Wolk. We are coming to you from the press box of the Louisiana Superdome in New Orleans, where we just watched the Georgia Bulldogs season end. Georgia loses to Notre Dame at 23-10. A very frustrating game, a game that there's a lot to get into with, and we're going to jump right into it. Georgia falls short against this Notre Dame team, number 2 Georgia, number 5 Notre Dame. Some huge plays right around halftime really swung this one. Georgia continued to threaten, appeared a few times like they had an opportunity to get back in this game, have a chance to win it. Ultimately could not. Georgia ends the season 11-3. Their season ends in Louisiana. Notre Dame is going on. They will play Penn State in the Orange Bowl as part of the college football playoff semifinal. So let's get into it, Ben, and just sort of an open-ended question to start. What stood out to you about this game, and what ultimately led to Georgia's season ending 3 wins short of a national title?
Well, I think there's a lot that we're going to be able to point to and talk about all offseason. I know there's going to be a lot of dialogue about the future of the Georgia football program as it related to it. But I mean, I think today, and I just wrote about this over at Dogs 24/7, but we talked about it at, just after halftime. There was a 53-second stretch of game action where Georgia gave up 17 points. And no matter what you want to say about the offensive line play or play calling or the quarterback change or the receiver's inability to catch passes at times throughout the course of the season, or the defense not necessarily living up to its standards at all points in time throughout this year, I think that you look at that 53-second stretch of game action where Notre Dame kicks a 48-yard field goal, which is a bigger moment than you really pay attention to at the time, because Notre Dame has had its fair share of field goal struggles this year, drills a 48-yarder that then sort of onsets everything that happened after it. Georgia has one play where R.J. Oben strip sacks Gunnar Stockton, recovered by Notre Dame. They get the ball deep inside the Georgia red zone. One play, Riley Leonard to Bo Collins. And you're sitting there thinking, man, that was about as bad of an end of first half situation as you could have. Georgia's got to get a stop coming out of halftime. And I think that we all had the conversation at halftime, like, can Georgia win this game? And I think that the answer was yes, but they have to make a stop early on. And worst case scenario unfolds coming out of halftime. Peyton Woodring, I think, told some other reporters after the game that he was supposed to be kicking the ball out of the back of the end zone. He just didn't get, full footing on it. Notre Dame recovers it. I think it was Jaden Harrison who's their kick returner. I want to get his name right because he's the first person to return a kick for a touchdown against Georgia since 2018. And for it to happen in that moment, given what Georgia's special teams have been in the Kirby Smart era, is almost just unthinkable that a situation like that could happen. But before you know it, Georgia goes from being tied 3-3 with 40 seconds left in the first half. They run one offensive play, and the next time the offense has the ball, they're down 20-3. It was about as bad of a picture that you could have drawn up for Gunnar Stockton, who, we'll get into this, I'm sure plenty, played well enough to win this football game. If you had read me Gunnar Stockton's stat line, 20 of 32, 234 yards and a touchdown. If you read to me Georgia against Notre Dame, just across the board statistically, Georgia outpasses Notre Dame by 144 yards, outgains them by 52 yards. Georgia had 17 first downs to Notre Dame's 14 first downs. Like, again, these are only stat sheet things. You can't obviously say what the scoreboard is going to look like just doing that. But you tell me those things before the game, I'm sitting here thinking we're talking about a Georgia win in the Sugar Bowl. And so I think that that's probably the most shell-shocking part of what happened, is that it was 53 seconds of game time that was just so unimaginable that by the time Georgia looked up, this has been one of the most resilient Georgia football teams that I've ever seen. I would assume you would feel the same way. It doesn't matter how resilient you are when you are given the circumstances of this week in New Orleans and the changing around of the game time, and you're not playing with your starting quarterback, even though the guy that ends up being your starting quarterback plays more than well enough to win the game, your defense steps up in some key situations, but it really doesn't matter. When you make those two mistakes, the strip sack, whiffing on the block, and then giving up the kick return at the start of the second half, it really doesn't matter anything else that you do. And people will point to all sorts of different things as to what needs to change for Georgia to fix a day like today. Georgia can't have those two moments in particular, the strip sack and the kick return, happen and find a way to win this game. I mean, I think Kirby Smart got a little bit frustrated post-game because he was getting asked, all of the various reasons why they lose. And he says it's not an exact science, but it's not hard to figure out. Trevor Etienne fumbles the ball in the red zone. Again, great play by the Notre Dame defensive player. RJ Oben makes a great play. I know a lot of folks are going to point to Monroe Freeling. He sort of misses on that block. Georgia offensive line did not play well in this game. Dylan Fairchild told you as much after the game that they did not live up to their standard. But ultimately, Notre Dame had a guy put a hat on a helmet to force Trevor Etienne to fumble. They've got a guy, RJ Oben, beats his man to strip sack Gunnar Stockton, and then the kick returner Jaden Harrison makes a play against a special teams unit that never lets things like that happen, and that was all it took.
Yeah, I mean, the thing to me, I talked about this when we were looking at the keys to the game. I want to shout out Irish Illustrated, those guys at our 24/7 site for Notre Dame. We had a lot of Q&As this week trying to learn a lot about this team. And the key that I pointed to and really harped on was turnover battle. Georgia did not create turnovers. I feel like that's something we didn't see them do a lot. And they gave away 2. I think that Notre Dame only turned one of those into 7 points, but it was a big 7 points. It was when Riley Leonard comes back after that Gunnar Stockton fumble. Great play action, sold the run, hit a receiver. I think it was Bo Collins in the end zone. And all of a sudden, I think at that point it was 13-3. And let's talk about that moment, the fumble specifically, because I think that there was a little bit of, hindsight being 2020. I didn't really mind Georgia trying to go get points at 6-3. You don't get the ball to start the third quarter, which I think is key in this conversation. They wanted to try to go get points. The first play, it wasn't any kind of crazy play. It's not like going back to last year's SEC title game where, you try to run a reverse and you have a bad pitch. Like, you expect your offensive line to block. And, it's sort of, I don't know if it's ironic or what the word you would say, but the thought I had about that moment in that fumble, I thought back to, if you remember, Ben, you might have still been in school at Georgia at the time, that Georgia-South Carolina game when Mike Bobo was the offensive coordinator, when Hudson Mason gets called for grounding and it moves the ball back, when it's like, why didn't you give Todd Gurley? It's like that situation is like, well, that was about the worst possible scenario that could have played out. And that's how I looked at that play. It's like, that wasn't ideal, but when they lined up there, I wasn't thinking, what the hell are you doing trying to go get points? It just was an outcome where it was just about as bad of an outcome as you could have in that moment.
Well, I think that's the thing about it, and you're right. Hindsight is going to be 2020. It's probably magnified a little bit because it's not too dissimilar to the last game against Texas, where you're in an end of half situation and you're trying to make something happen late. Georgia wanted to be aggressive. Kirby Smart said that they were going to be aggressive. And I think that more often than not, Georgia fans get frustrated when Kirby Smart takes the conservative approach and tries to run out the clock at the end or kneel it out to end the half. And I think the last 2 weeks you saw they're trying to take a shot on a Hail Mary at the end of the first half. That gets Carson Beck injured. You're trying to get aggressive because you just went down 3 and you're not getting the ball to start the second half and you'd like to get into field goal range. Kirby Smart mentioned it postgame. I mean, Georgia was throwing the ball pretty efficiently down, at multiple areas of the field at that point in time. I mean, Georgia threw the ball better than Notre Dame from start to finish. And so I think, to your point, when you're calling that, when you're making that decision, when you're Kirby Smart and Mike Bobo and you're making that decision, you think about what the negatives can be, but for the worst case scenario to unfold is just unfortunate. Like, I don't think that you can just look at that and say, well, it was the wrong call because of how it turned out. Well, you're not expecting Monroe Freeling to whiff on a block. You're not expecting RJ Oben to just completely dominate his man up front and get to Gunnar Stockton as quick as he possibly could have. I mean, that's the thing about it is Gunnar was getting the ball out pretty quick on that play, but it was just such an unfortunate meltdown really up front that it's just you don't call a situation like that thinking the worst thing that could possibly happen is going to happen. It did. And that ended up sort of being the difference maker. And I think that what hurts the most about that is, I mean, that was the only offensive touchdown that Notre Dame had the entire game. They did not have a touchdown drive in this game. I mean, they got the kick return. They had the quick, easy one after the Gunnar strip sack. But I mean, I think that's probably the hardest part of it to swallow is the defense was not going to be giving up touchdowns in this game. And I think that situation was the only situation that could have happened where Notre Dame was going to be able to get offensive points or get into the end zone on offense at least.
Yeah, I mean, the defense I thought played well enough to win. I mean, we were talking about this before we started recording. There's been so many moments in this season where you're like, Georgia's dead in the water. They have no shot. Like their chances are done. And then they do something where you go, all right, okay, maybe not. Like that Georgia Tech game where Dan Jackson causes the fumble. I go back to the first Texas game where 3rd and 15 and Texas has the momentum and Carson hits Arian Smith. And there were moments in that second half where you were seeing it, where you're like, when they got that stop on, I guess that was 4th and 1, and it was like, I was sitting there going, I cannot believe this. They are going to get back in this game and potentially have a chance to, I think they needed 2 scores at that point, but like it was totally feasible. They could go back and score, and then they turn around and they have a turnover on downs themselves. And on that play, which I mentioned in a story that I wrote on Thursday night, they gave up a lot of pressure on that 4th down, and Gunnar had to get it out quick, got it to Dylan Bell, and he wasn't able to really do anything with it. And, I give Dylan Fairchild a lot of credit. I talked to him in the post game and wrote this in the story that he said, offensive line didn't play to the standard, did not play the way they had to. And were you as surprised as I was, Ben, with the offensive line? Because, the conversation coming in this game was about Notre Dame's front, and they lost Riley Mills, who was probably their best defensive lineman. And it's a line that had lost several guys as this season has wore on. And I was sitting there thinking, okay, Trevor Etienne's going to run for about 80 yards. They're going to really rely on that run game. They're going to let those guys turn loose. Gunnar might run maybe some design runs, but this is going to be a run the ball game. And it just wasn't. And I give a lot of credit to Notre Dame. I mean, I thought they whipped Georgia up front. They made it difficult. And I think that had a lot to do with Georgia having those drives, but just not being able to sustain them once they got in the red area and not getting 7 points when they had to have them.
Well, it's easy to say now, but clearly too much was made of what kind of step back Notre Dame might make defensively with the defensive line injury, specifically to Riley Mills. We mentioned it on, it was either the first or second possession of the game, that there was so much more team speed on the Notre Dame defensive front than I realized, and it was noticeable right away. I mean, they were flying around out there. To your point, I think everyone's point really, we were expecting Georgia to be able to run the ball a lot more effectively today than other times this season. That just didn't turn out to be the case. I mean, including Gunnar Stockton's sack stats, Georgia only rushed for 62 yards. That did have 4 sacks in there, so it was a little bit better than that. But again, including those sack stats, 2.1 yards per carry. Trevor Etienne only goes for 3.5 yards per carry. They just could not get anything going on the ground. And, if you look at the stat sheet, you would think Georgia had won the game. Now, obviously, it's not factoring in the kick return, which was a key moment. But you look at 2 things. You look at the turnover margin, obviously Notre Dame. You look at that part of it. You say, all right, Notre Dame gets the favor there. You also look at the rushing stats. And, Georgia got outgained by 92 yards in the run game. Just an all season long, an uncharacteristic Georgia football team. I think I saw that it was the lowest rushing yards per game in the Kirby Smart era up to this point, and I think it was by a significant margin, by about 50 yards per game. Georgia just didn't run the ball well all year long. You might have thought that Gunnar Stockton was going to – the offense would see an uptick with Gunnar Stockton's legs, but they just really weren't able to get that side of the offense going at any point this year. That sustained today. And, I will say, I have been one of the whether I've said it as publicly or not, like I have been one of the bigger critics of how I felt that Gunnar Stockton would be able to play in an environment like this, or just in general, what my perception of his ability was. That dude played well enough to win the Sugar Bowl, and he showed me some things today that truly shocked me. Like there were some moments, the deep ball to Arian Smith, he fit one in the middle of the field to Dylan Bell on like a 3rd and 12 or something like that. And early on in the game, I think Georgia found itself in a 3rd and 12, 3rd and 9, 3rd and 7, 3rd and 8, and I'm sitting there thinking, Georgia, they have the wrong quarterback to be finding themselves in these 3rd and long situations, and Gunnar Stockton did not flinch. What he did with his arm today really impressed me. Unfortunately, it's just the element that he brought with his legs wasn't enough to be a difference for Georgia to be able to run the ball. And ultimately, I think Georgia's inability to run the ball was always going to be its Achilles heel on offense this year.
Totally agree. And I mean, it's almost fitting that it didn't happen after an entire season where it's been so hit or miss. I want to say this before we go to a break, and we'll come back and talk a little bit more about this game, and we'll talk about sort of the wrapping up this season for Georgia, and also talk about what's left of the playoff. If y'all are blaming Noah Jones for this loss, y'all are some losers, because he had Parker Jones. Don't blame either one of those guys. Parker Jones. So there's the play on the Arian Smith 67-yard catch where Parker Jones draws a penalty because he was kind of running down the sideline. He's a walk-on. He doesn't play for this team at all. And he draws a penalty. We were all kind of surprised that they even threw the penalty. Usually you get a warning. And looking back at it, I thought it could have been a warning. I didn't think it was anything egregious. But at the same time, that penalty does not set up like a 1st and 25. It just moved back the catch. It's not like all of a sudden Georgia's way behind the chains. Like, was that ideal? Absolutely not. Did Parker Jones regret that? And I'm sure the coaching staff got on him. Hell yeah. And I'm sure he's got a lot of texts. And, I saw he was trending on X at one point. But, I don't put anything on him. It was a play that, he'd like to have it back, but it did not crush Georgia. Georgia should have been able to overcome that. A regrettable mistake by a walk-on, but if you're blaming him for this loss, you must have just not watched the rest of the game. I guess he's Parker Jones. I guess he's responsible for Cash Jones not making the tackle on that kick return. Like, there were so many other things that lost in this game. I don't think Parker Jones was one of those reasons.
I know it's hard to bring levity, and if you're a Georgia fan, I know tonight's a tough night. I feel like the Parker Jones situation is one of those things that's just good, funny internet content. I know that that's not going to be received well by a lot of people here, but the slow-mo with his facial reaction and the referee bumping into him, I mean, it's just the type of, truth be told, that this Georgia football team in a nutshell, they found weird ways for weird things to happen all season long. And, it didn't surprise me in the slightest that a situation like that was happening. I'm with you. I was a little bit surprised that it caught a 15-yard interference penalty and not, maybe a little bit of a warning or whatever that might have been. I mean, I'm not one to take shots at officials, because I think that so much more goes into the game like that. And, the rules are the rules. He was sort of in the way of the official, and the official had, was well within his rights to make that call. But take it easy on Parker Jones. He's going to be catching a lot of heat. And, I don't know what his future holds at Georgia, because I really don't even know what his present has held at Georgia. But I assume that if he's around this football program in the future, he will serve whatever consequences you guys want him to serve for that.
Yeah, I just look out for the walk-ons, man. They don't get any love. He's getting beat up, I'm sure, at practice. So, I think, if you want to do it in fun, yeah, but I wouldn't.
Hey, Kirby's the number one proponent on earth for the walk-on program. He's the one that's been the loudest saying the 105 is bad because it eliminates all the walk-ons. So we'll see if he changes his tune on that after that one, but I feel like he won't. I think he still believes in that walk-on program.
We'll take a quick break, come back, just give a few final thoughts on this game, talk about the season as a whole, and then talk about what's left of this college football playoff and who we think winds up being the national champion. All right, Ben, we're not going to be on here a ton longer. We're going to get a chance to get out of here, but I do want to kind of get final thoughts from this game. Aaron Smith with that big catch you mentioned, I think he deserves credit for that, and that was a great throw from Gunnar Stockton. I come out of this game, I know Georgia lost. I feel very confident Gunner's going to be your starter in 2025. I'm trying to think of some of the other things that really stood out to me. Some of those guys like Damon Wilson, I like what they showed. I think that the linebacker room, I know they're going to lose Jalen Walker, and he put on a show tonight, which it's really disappointing and maybe not fitting for him that he goes out on a loss because he was playing fantastic.
He was also called for the offsides on the punt shift, which is
you want to get into
I will
that
get
play.
into that real quick. Again, like I've already prefaced earlier saying that I'm not a refs guy. I complain about the refs guy, and I am not complaining about the refs, but I did at least want to articulate something that Kirby talked about post-game. So I thought the play of the fourth quarter that I think was the dagger in the game was Notre Dame gets to a 4th and 1 situation deep inside of its own territory, a natural punt situation. But I think that Marcus Freeman very wisely realized, hey, let's try and take advantage of this situation because Georgia had already called a timeout earlier in the second half. And I think that he realized, get them to burn a timeout, get them to do something weird, create a little bit of chaos. And so he brings the punt unit out and then subs off the full 11 and brings the offense back on, which Georgia was given time to get its defensive unit out there. But as Kirby Smart was trying to articulate to the referees in the moment, and then he asked about this and answered it post game, his understanding of the rule is that you cannot sub 11 for 11, and that was a situation that he says happened in the 2017 Georgia-Tennessee game, that they were notified you are not able to sub 11 for 11. And so Kirby Smart, if you go back and watch, or if you have the Skycam TV footage, you might be able to see this. He is very animatedly trying to get this point across to the officials as this play was unfolding. And then after the play unfolded as well, and they end up going for it. They try. I don't know whether they were going to go for it or not, whether they were just trying to jump them off sides, but the call on the field was Jalen Walker off sides. Looking back at the replay, it looks to me, I can't tell quite who it was, but one of the interior defensive linemen hand jumps into the neutral zone. That's what the penalty was. You could also probably see a wide receiver on that play move a little bit early. But again, I think it was such a heads up coaching move by Marcus Freeman, whether or not it was, what is allowed within the rules or not. He wanted to create some chaos in that moment, and they got the exact end result out of that situation that they wanted. It got them a first down that really iced the game. But I did want to call that out when you brought Jalen Walker out, just because one of the last moments of his Georgia career is going to be referees calling out a Jalen Walker offsides penalty that gave a very costly first down. And I don't think that he was in any way responsible for that neutral zone infraction. And we can, get into whatever about the ruling or, the rule, what the rule says about what you can do substitution wise and not. But I did want to clear Jalen Walker's name on that one.
And well deserved. He should not get that slander. Lauren Hamilton on YouTube says the rules official on ESPN said it was legal. And Kirby basically said afterwards he didn't really get a clear explanation from the crew when he was looking for it. Ben, any other thoughts? I'm trying to think here. Drew Miller got put in some tough spots, especially to open this game where they were just coming after him and the referees were pretty cool with it, running into the kicker versus Ruffin. You have any thoughts on that one?
Another situation that I will give Marcus Freeman and whoever on the Notre Dame side for sort of creating some chaos in that situation. Georgia gets itself into a 4th and forever early, and so they realized anything but a roughing penalty gets them off the field. And you could have probably seen it go either way with a roughing the punter on Drew Miller's first punt attempt. I think on the second one, it was very clear that it was not going to be roughing because it was not as egregious as the first one. Very savvy by Notre Dame to realize this is a new punter. This is his first time punting in a big time situation. I actually thought that Drew Miller came out of the game great. I mean, for him to get both of those 2 punts off to begin with was huge. Whenever you're getting bullied like that on your first 2 punts of your career, for you to respond back, he had a 48-yarder that didn't have a return. Like, I thought that, he proved why Georgia was, trusting in him in that one. If we're just talking other takeaways from this Georgia football season, like I think at a certain point we've all watched Georgia football teams that have been as dominant as any football team in the history of the sport. Like the 21 team at times, the 22 team really from start to finish was just so dominant. They would jump out to early leads. Once they were in the lead, they would hold on to it. They won turnover battles. Like at a certain point during this season, I think you had to be real with yourself that this Georgia football team was not the same type of Georgia football team as previous ones. I mean, there were clear identity flaws. We've talked about the inability to run the ball. We've talked about the fact that the defense, probably got gashed at times throughout the year on a regular basis more than they have in years past. I mean, multiple players brought this up after the game, and I'm sure it was a talking point for Kirby after the game, but Georgia trailed in 9 games this season. It's hard to win a national championship when you're trailing 9 times through, if you're trying to win 16, 17 games, whatever, but through 14 games, losing or trailing 9 times. That's not a great recipe for success. And I think that when you look back on this year, there were symptoms all year long that this team was going to, at certain points, run into troubles when it came to winning a national championship. Winning 1 time against playoff caliber teams is hard, as evidenced by today. Winning 3 or 4 times against playoff caliber teams is going to be really, really challenging when you are not as perfect as you have been in years past. And I think that it's probably a lesson for us in the future. When you look at Georgia teams, they will tell you what type of football team they are. They will give you the signs of what you should expect out of this team. And I think that this team, for some of its resiliency and many positive qualities that this team had that others might not have had quite that level of DNA to it, there was enough football problems with this team that it was always going to be a challenge. And I just think that showed up in, the worst way today.
I sort of thinking about, like you said, them trailing in 9 games. I kind of had the mental image of like a cartoon where it's like the cartoon character puts their finger in a dam and another hole pops up and you try to put it up there and like, you're kind of sitting sideways. It's like, it felt like they did that so many times. Yep. And like, it's sometimes when you watch a team, and I feel like this is the case with Georgia, there are conclusions that get reached. And afterwards you go, well, yeah, of course that's how that played out. It's like, no kidding. That's how it played out. And I felt like this was sort of one of those games where it was just like the lucky breaks they continue to get. And I say lucky breaks, that's not without them putting themselves in position, not only to get those breaks but to also capitalize. Eventually you're just not going to get those breaks. And we were talking with some of the other beat writers after this game, a point I made, I thought Gunner played great. Gunner was not the reason they lost, but I do think that you can't just totally discredit. This is a team that lost its starting quarterback. Carson Beck was the starter for a reason. That's not nothing. Now, I can't sit here and tell you, well, if Carson Beck starts this game, Georgia wins. I can't go that far, but more to say that it's not nothing. And I keep going back to the superlatives episode we did talking about this season to that point and, what, we thought of this team and the word we used to describe it. And I think it was you that said agonizing. And this team was kind of live by the sword, die by the sword, and live life on the edge. And that made for some really fun experiences with like the Georgia Tech game and some of the other really thrilling games, the Alabama game, even though they lost it. But when you live that way, eventually you're going to get got against a really good team. And I think that's, basically the simple explanation of what we saw in the Superdome on Thursday.
Completely.
All right, let's talk about the college football playoff really quickly before we get out of here. So the matchups remaining, you have got Notre Dame and Penn State in the Orange Bowl. That's one of the semifinals. Then Ohio State and Texas in the Cotton Bowl. And then the winner of each of those games will play in Atlanta for the national title. So, Ben, I'll start with you. Who wins each of those semifinal games? Who is in the national title game? And who wins that national title?
Well, both great matchups, honestly. I know it's probably hard for Georgia folks to admit that at this point in time, but 4 great historic college football brands that are going to be playing each other in this semifinals. I feel personally like Ohio State is playing the best football. I feel like they have been the most talented, best team all season long. I mean, they've lost 2 games by a combined 4 points. One of them was to a rival that sort of just happens to have their number, and one was on the road to a team that they completely dismantled last night. I think Ohio State wins this national championship. I think that they are going to win pretty convincingly against Texas, just because I don't feel like Texas has the offensive firepower to be able to hang with Ohio State and Jeremiah Smith and all of the horses that they've got in that one. I'm fascinated by this Notre Dame Penn State game, mainly because, and we talked about this when the bracket came out, and the natural reaction of everyone in the Georgia world, it felt like, was to say Georgia caught a really good draw. And I just did not feel that way. And I think the reason I did not feel that way is because I think there is an inherent disrespect of the Notre Dame football program and the Penn State football program, maybe elsewhere, but definitely within the Georgia universe. And we learned tonight that you cannot disrespect Notre Dame's football program, which, by the way, Georgia's played Notre Dame's football program 3 times in the last 7 years, and every single game has been close. Well, this was the least competitive game that the two teams have played. And so maybe it's about time that people start respecting the Notre Dame football program the way that it should be, because I think everyone looks at the 45-0 game against Alabama 15 years ago now, and that says that's the Notre Dame football program. It's not. I also think that this Penn State football team is another one that people naturally they've all year long done the poo-pooing of, oh, Drew Aller, the talent, whatever. They've got 2 of the best running backs in the country. They have dominated their first 2 playoff games. No, I don't care who it is they played. They've dominated their first 2 playoff games. They've got as good a team speed on the defensive side of the ball as anybody that's left. And so I struggle to pick who I think is going to win that game. I think that both of them, I think I saw that Notre Dame opened as a 1.5 point favorite. Wouldn't shock me if it was like the Georgia Notre Dame game where it flips back and forth a couple of times between now and kickoff. After watching Notre Dame only throw for 90 yards against Georgia, I probably favor Drew Aller over Riley Leonard in that specific matchup. And so I would probably lean Penn State, but I think that's going to be a hell of a football game. And I think that whoever wins the Ohio State-Texas game is going to be viewed nationally as the favorite going into the national championship game. And I think that if Ohio State wins, that will certainly be deservedly the case. But I think that if Texas finds a way to win that game against Ohio State, I think that the winner of the Notre Dame-Penn State game has a chance to pull off one of the more unlikely national championships in recent memory, and not because of the caliber of teams that they are, but just the way that they have been perceived nationally throughout the entire year. So I think it'll be an awesome opportunity for one of those 2 programs to be playing in a national championship game regardless.
I'm going to go Notre Dame beats Penn State. I do think that'll be a very competitive game. And then I got Ohio State over Texas. I think Ohio State is the hottest team in the country right now. And I'm going to pick an upset and say that Notre Dame upsets Ohio State. Marcus Freeman, an Ohio State grad, they played a really good game. I guess that was last season. I'm going to say that the Fighting Irish find a way to slow down Jeremiah Smith and those guys, and Notre Dame wins the national title. I think sincerely, whoever wins these 2 semifinal games, I think it's going to make for a really fun, really entertaining national championship game, because I sincerely think any of the 4 teams that are still standing have a legitimate chance to win the national title.
I agree. I also think there's a world where Ohio State just beats everybody by 20 plus, and they are who they always were, and they just lost 2 close games during the regular season.
All right. Well, I think we're done here. Ben, any thoughts wrapping up your second season back on the beat? Anything before we end this podcast?
Yeah, started covering the Georgia football program right after they won 2 national championships, and they've proceeded to not win any national championships since then. So we'll take as much of the responsibility as folks want to give us.
I don't know what the we is. I've covered a national championship.
I'll take as much of the responsibility on that as people want. I want to tip my cap to Notre Dame. They played a hell of a football game today. They had a couple guys on the defensive side of the ball that made some critical plays, causing turnovers. That was the difference in this game. And there's always a reaction after losses like this to point the finger within your own program and say, these coaches didn't get it done. These players didn't get it done. And look, I'm not saying that some of those things don't have some merit to them, Notre Dame went out and won this football game today. They went out and made a couple of plays on the defensive side of the ball in critical spots, and they had a kick return touchdown. Sometimes individual performances are enough to win these football games, and that's what happened. Notre Dame had 3 guys that made 3 individual plays, forced fumble, kick return touchdown, that were enough for it to be the difference in this football game, and Notre Dame deserves the ultimate credit for that.
I have learned over the years of doing this that more often than not, games like this, there's 4 or 5 plays where you can point to and say that's where it swung, or that's why this team got down. And this was one of those games. And Notre Dame had more of those plays that really put them over the top, and they deserve credit. It's going to be fascinating to see what happens next with Georgia, just because of a typical offseason. I'm not expecting anything in particular, but we're going to be watching the portal. We're going to be watching who is going to declare for the NFL draft. We're going to pay
coaching
attention.
Carousel.
That's what's going to say, any potential coaching changes. So it's going to be busy still. I would encourage folks to stay glued to Dogs 24/7. We're going to have you covered. 2 quick things before I wrap this up. We want to extend our thoughts and prayers to everyone affected down here in New Orleans. I can't imagine the people who were directly affected by that terrorist attack. Even just being here was surreal. And Ben, I know you had sort of been out there in that area earlier that night, so very significant. And also want to extend thoughts and prayers with Sonny Smart, Kirby Smart's dad, had fallen earlier this week and had, I think he broke his hip, so he was having surgery. I just wanted to pass that along before we end this.
Yeah, I mean, another crazy, one of the crazier Georgia football seasons that I can remember. It felt like chaos was never going to end, but now it finally has.
It has, and we'll sleep for a few days, and then Ben, let's do it for Georgia basketball. Jump on the Georgia basketball train.
Let's do it. I'll see you at the Final Four.
Can't wait to see that. So we'll wrap it up there. I appreciate everyone who watched us live, everyone who is watching or listening to it after the fact. Appreciate Ben for popping on. Ben's done such a great job, especially on these podcasts. Hate to tell him, but I really enjoy listening to his solo pods. He's done a good job. We'll have to continue those in the next season. Go to Dogs 24/7, subscribe there. Go to our YouTube, go to our TikTok, all kinds of good stuff on those feeds. So we will wrap it up right there to close out the 2024 season. For Ben Wolk, I'm Jordan Hill. Until next time, take care, everybody.